Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wondered if we are good at spotting discrimination, or if we sometimes see it when it is not really there? This paper dives deep into that very question, and it turns out how we decide if something is unfair is more complicated than we might think. Today we're talking about spotting discrimination, specifically gender discrimination in decisions about things like pay raises. Imagine a workplace where someone gets a promotion or a raise. How do we know if that decision was fair? This research uses a cool psychological tool called signal detection theory, which sounds fancy. But it's basically a way to figure out two different things influencing our judgment, our actual ability to spot something when it's there and our tendency to guess or assume something is there. The scientists wanted to understand what makes us attribute an outcome to discrimination. They looked at decisions about pay raises in a company. They played out different scenarios where employees got raises or were denied them, and they looked at whether these decisions seemed fair or unfair, and if they might be linked to gender bias. They found that our gut feelings about what discrimination looks like if it harms people and our expectations about who might be targeted, really influence whether we think discrimination is happening. Importantly, they figured out that sometimes the problem isn't that we can't spot discrimination, but that we're already biased in how we make judgments, or that we have our own ideas about what is fair before we even see the decision. Discrimination is when people are treated unfairly because of who they are, like their gender. Spotting it is the first step to stopping it. But the evidence for discrimination is often not super clear. Think about it. You see someone being treated rudely, but you don't know if they treat everyone that way, or if it's because of their group membership. Standards for fairness are also not always obvious. And when discrimination happens, people are often really good at hiding it. So judging discrimination happens in a situation with a lot of uncertainty. That is where signal detection theory comes in. Originally used to understand how we detect faint signals, like a quiet sound. It helps psychologists separate two key things in our judgments under uncertainty. The first is sensitivity, which is our actual ability to tell the difference between a real signal and just noise. Or in this case, between discrimination and a fair decision. The second is response bias, which is our tendency to say, yes, there is discrimination, or no, there isn't, more often, regardless of the actual evidence. Think of it like this. If discrimination is the signal, and a fair decision is noise, we can either correctly identify discrimination, hit, or miss it, miss. We can also wrongly assume discrimination is there when it is not, a false alarm. Or correctly say there is no discrimination, a correct rejection. Signal detection theory helps us measure our ability to distinguish between signal and noise, which is called sensitivity, represented by D', and our tendency to be liberal or conservative in calling something a signal, which is called response bias, represented by C. The researchers realized that while people have talked about discrimination using signal detection theory for a long time, no one had really done the deep dive testing these ideas with actual data in this way. So, they created a new task to actually measure these things, called the bias detection task. In this task, participants were shown many examples of pay raise decisions. They were told how the company should give raises based on employee scores, setting up a standard for fairness. Then they were shown decisions made by a panel of supervisors and had to decide if those decisions looked biased. They saw cases where people deserved raises but didn't get them, or got them when they didn't deserve them. This allowed the researchers to collect a lot of data to apply signal detection theory. Study 1 was like a baseline. They wanted to see if things like how much harm a decision caused, or if the person affected fit the typical victim of discrimination, influenced people's judgments. They also looked at whether the gender of the participant mattered. Even before study 1, they did a pilot study. They found that people were more likely to think a decision was biased if it denied a pay raise harmful than if it granted one beneficial. This was a response bias effect, meaning it wasn't about spotting discrimination better, but about being more ready to label unfair outcomes as biased when they caused harm. They also saw that people were more likely to see discrimination when it involved women being denied raises and men getting them, which fits common stereotypes. Interestingly, they found that men were sometimes more sensitive than women, meaning they were better at actually telling the difference between fair and unfair decisions. This was surprising. So, in study 1, they used their bias detection task. Participants first learned the fair way to make pay raise decisions. Then, in the evaluation phase, they looked at a bunch of actual panel decisions and had to flag the ones they suspected were biased. They saw pictures and names of employees and their scores. And the panel's decision. The design was set up so that sometimes the panel decisions were indeed unfair. And crucially, sometimes they favored men over women. This was the stereotypical gender bias condition. And the results confirmed the pilot. First, the harm from a decision greatly affected response bias. People were much more likely to flag a denied pay raise as potentially biased than a granted one, even if the evidence wasn't perfectly clear. They were more willing to sound the alarm when harm was involved. This meant they were using a more liberal response bias, meaning they needed less evidence to suspect bias when something bad happened. And that surprising finding from the pilot study held up. Men were indeed more sensitive than women. This means men were a bit better at actually distinguishing between cases with real discrimination and cases without it. This goes against the expectation that women might be more sensitive due to their experiences. So, study 1 showed that harm influences our tendency to suspect bias, response bias, more than our ability to tell discrimination apart from fair decision sensitivity. It also showed that common stereotypes about gender discrimination, like women being denied raises, also impacted this bias. And men were better at actually spotting discrimination than women. Now, study 2 wanted to dig deeper into why stereotypes affect our judgments and why men seem to be better at spotting discrimination. They introduced a new condition, reversed bias. In this condition, the panel decisions were counter-stereotypical, meaning women were favored and men were disfavored in the pay raises. When they compared the stereotypical bias condition to the reverse bias condition, they found something really interesting about response bias. The tendency to see discrimination was reduced in the reverse bias condition, but it didn't completely disappear. This suggested that people were learning the new patterns contingencies in the data, but their old beliefs or stereotypes about how discrimination usually works, prototypes, were still influencing them. This meant that our judgment isn't just about spotting what is happening now, but also about our ingrained ideas. The threat hypothesis was also tested. If women feel more threatened by discrimination against them, they might perform worse. But in the reverse bias condition, where women were favored, women still were more sensitive than men. This made the threat explanation less likely. Study 3 aimed to get a clearer picture of sensitivity. They changed the design so that there was no systematic gender bias in the panel decisions at all. This removed any learned patterns and focused more on the pure stereotypes people might bring in. They found that even with no bias in the decisions, there was still a tendency to see discrimination in harmful outcomes, and that women were still less sensitive than men. This further supported the idea that the difference in sensitivity might be due to factors other than immediate threat in the experiment, like how the participants were initially selected. Here, harm still pushed people towards suspecting bias, response bias, but it only slightly increased sensitivity. The gender difference in sensitivity remained, which really makes explanations like selection bias more plausible. Selection bias means that the groups we study, like men and women, might differ in ways other than just their gender because of how participants are recruited. Study 4 wanted to see if the context of the decisions mattered. They compared the pay raise scenario to a placement scenario, where employees were assigned to departments. Importantly, in the placement scenario, there was no inherent harm because both departments were equally good. They wanted to see if removing the harm and the biased context would change the results. In the placement condition, the effect of the panel's decision on response bias almost disappeared. This showed that the idea of harm was crucial for that particular bias. Also, the interaction between employee gender and the panel decision was greatly reduced. This suggested that stereotypes only really influence judgments when there is a real-world context that fits those stereotypes. This study strongly indicated that the context really matters, and that simply having patterns doesn't create bias if it doesn't align with our existing expectations or if the outcomes aren't clearly harmful. The persistent gender difference in sensitivity also pointed away from threat and towards selection bias or other stable differences. Finally, study 5 got really interesting. They wanted to separate when these biases happen in our thinking. They used a task where participants had to make the decisions themselves, rather than judging an existing panel's decisions. This helped them distinguish between the standard application stage, deciding what is fair in the first place, and the attributional processing stage, deciding why a decision was unfair. They found that the bias in judging harmful decisions as more likely to be discriminatory happened even when people made the decisions themselves. This suggests that this bias might come from a general tendency to be more lenient or generous when making decisions, not just from interpreting unfairness. However, the interaction between employee gender and the decision, which was linked to stereotypes, did disappear when people made their own decisions. This is a huge finding. It means that the effect of harm on our judgment might come from how we initially set our standards for fairness, but the effects related to gender stereotypes seem to kick in later during the attributional processing stage, when we're trying to figure out the cause of unfairness. This shows that different factors influencing our perception of discrimination operate at different stages of our thinking. So, what is the big picture here? This research used a cool new way to measure how people detect discrimination, separating sensitivity from response bias and looking at different stages of decision making. They found that harm strongly influences our tendency to suspect discrimination, response bias. And this bias seems to come from a general tendency to be more lenient when making decisions, not just a later interpretation of unfairness. The interaction between harm and gender also strongly affected response bias, and this seemed to come from stereotypes and learned patterns acting at the attributional processing stage. It is like our initial idea of what fair even looks like is already influenced by things like harm. And then our interpretation of why something is unfair gets shaped by stereotypes. The sensitivity difference where men were consistently better at actually detecting discrimination than women was a persistent puzzle. They explored explanations like threat and speed accuracy trade-offs, but nothing quite fit. The most likely explanation remaining is selection bias, meaning the groups of men and women who participated might have differed in unmeasured ways. This highlights a crucial point. When we study differences between groups like men and women, we have to be careful about why those differences exist. It might not always be about the thing we're directly studying, like gender bias itself. The authors are upfront about limitations. They studied only gender bias in a specific context: corporate pay raises. Real-world situations can be far more complex, involving multiple biases and different kinds of decisions. The findings might not perfectly transfer to, say, racial bias or hiring decisions. Also, the mathematical models they used have assumptions that might not always be perfectly met. They suggest many avenues for future research. How does the whole situation change sensitivity and bias if positive outcomes are rare, like in competitive admissions? What about when people have prior beliefs about how much a certain company discriminates? Can we train people to be more sensitive, not just change their bias? These are all fascinating questions. What does this all mean for us? Firstly, our tendency to suspect discrimination is more easily swayed by things like harm and stereotypes. Response bias than our actual ability to detect its sensitivity. This means programs trying to combat bias might need to focus on changing expectations and beliefs, rather than just telling people to look harder. Secondly, understanding when these biases happen during our initial idea of fairness or later during our interpretation is key to designing effective interventions. The idea that our own standards for fairness can be a source of bias is particularly powerful. It suggests that to truly be fair, we need to look critically at our own baseline assumptions about what justice means. This study is a great example of how psychology can use sophisticated tools to unpack complex human judgments. It shows that our perception of discrimination is shaped by many factors, from the actual outcomes to our learned stereotypes, to our fundamental beliefs about fairness. It's a reminder that spotting bias isn't always straightforward, and we all have work to do in making our judgments as fair as possible. What are your thoughts on these findings? Do you think harm or stereotypes influence your perception of fairness more? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown helpful, please give it a like and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more explorations into the fascinating world of psychology. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.